Greetings. My name is Stéphanie Larrieux. I am the Associate Director at the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, CSREA, at Brown University. This is Underlying Conditions. I'm here today with Associate Professor of Environmental Science and Policy Management at University of California, Berkeley, Elizabeth Hoover. Elizabeth has taught in the American Studies Department at Brown University for 9 years and served on the steering committee for the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative at Brown. She's the author of The River is in Us, Fighting Toxics in a Mohawk Community, and co-editor of Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. Welcome, Professor Hoover, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Underlying Conditions.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Your work keenly explores the disparate health conditions faced by Native communities and the efforts by many community groups to address these health problems through increasing community access to traditional foods, whether by gardening projects or a revival of hunting and fishing traditions. What is the relationship between environment and Indigenous community health as you understand it?
So that's been a focus of a lot of my work, has been looking at what happens when people's environment, the relationship with that environment is disrupted, especially by environmental contamination. So in a healthy society, in a healthy Indigenous community, people are able to interact with the environment as they have for thousands of years. And that's important for ceremonies, for food sources, for language. You know, a lot of people's traditional languages is built on interactions with the environment. People's interactions with each other are based on the ability to be able to interact with the environment, to be part of that natural environment. You know, food sources, fishing, hunting, farming, gardening, foraging, all rely on a clean and healthy environment. So in cases where that's been disrupted, so you mentioned the book that I worked on with folks in the Mohawk community of Akwesasne, there they were downstream from 1 federal and 2 state Superfund sites that contaminated the environment with PCBs and other toxics, which then left them with the choice of, do they continue eating their traditional foods like fish out of the St. Lawrence River, or do they stop eating those fish in order to protect themselves from being exposed to these contaminants? And then when people have to abruptly change their diet because they're worried about being exposed to toxics by eating their traditional foods, they then have to worry about the kind of metabolic disorders that communities often face when they shift from a traditional diet of lean meats and lots of fruits and vegetables to a lot of high carb, high sodium, high sugared foods that are preserved and very shelf stable. So in many cases, you know, in order to have good health, whether that's social health, physical health, cultural health, you need a clean environment to be able to interact with. And for Native communities, you know, anybody needs a clean environment to be able to be healthy. People living in an urban setting, you know, when the environment around them has been contaminated, whether that's with particulates in the air or chemicals in the ground, that's going to impact your health. But especially for people who have relied for a very long time on the environment as a source of food, then they're even more likely to be impacted by a contaminated environment.
There's a body of research and reporting on the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on communities of color in general, but I'd like us to focus a moment on the coronavirus's impact on the Diné people of Navajo Nation. Back in May 2020, CNN reported that, quote, the Navajo Nation has surpassed New York and New Jersey for the highest per capita coronavirus infection rate in the US, end quote. And at one point, the international organization Doctors Without Borders, in a rare mission to and within the US, dispatched medical professionals to the area to address the viral spread. Can you talk a little bit about why the Navajo have been hit so hard? What are the conditions on reservations that might account for this?
So when the people first started becoming concerned about the coronavirus, COVID-19, and how to protect yourself, how to prevent the transmission of infection, the kind of advice that everyone was being given was, wash your hands all the time, distance yourselves from other people, stay spread out, don't be clustered together. And if you want to be healthy in general, you need access to good, healthy food on top of it all. And many of these things are a challenge on the Navajo Nation. So not everybody has running water. People are reliant on aquifers, and in some cases, those have been impacted by mining companies that are draining that water in order to slurry, coal and uranium and other kinds of mined metals. And so people are already faced with challenges as far as, having access to all this clean water and access to food. A lot of the grocery stores are very far away from people. So if they're not growing their own food, they're buying from convenience stores. And there have been community organizations on Navajo Nation that worked to create a junk food tax to try to encourage people to buy healthier options, but it can be challenging when there aren't healthier options in those stores. Also, when it comes to mortality from COVID-19, if people have underlying health conditions like diabetes, that also can impact your ability to recover. So on Navajo Nation, as in many Indigenous communities, you have higher rates of diabetes than for the general population. Dene folks have also been facing uranium mining contamination left over from the 50s. And so you have all these abandoned mines, and that has impacted people's health, kidney function and other things. So when you have underlying health conditions, whether that's from not having access to sufficient healthy food or having your health impacted by environmental contamination left behind by the US government, that can lead to much higher mortality rate from illnesses like COVID-19.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then just getting access to medical care can be challenging. The IHS, the Indian Health Service, is always underfunded, and increasingly so. This administration has not been friendly toward the needs of Native people, of people of color, of people who don't have a lot of financial resources. And for Native people, many folks rely on Indian Health Service. And this is a service that was developed as part of the treaty relationship that the United States government has with many Indigenous communities. So it was an agreement that was made after a great deal of land was taken. And so it's not just some sort of, oh, here's a nice little present for you. It's something that was part of an agreement, a transaction. But these health services in many communities are underfunded, and so you don't have the respirators. There was a very hard time getting the personal protective equipment, and it really fell on community members and grassroots organizations in communities like Navajo to try to get access to that personal protective equipment, to get to healthcare providers, to get to people who are having a lot of interactions with community members. So essentially, the federal government has failed these communities very hard, and people have been working really hard on a grassroots level to try to get access to the resources they need to protect people's health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really just your response there really illuminates for us exactly how these different factors are interconnected and causing or making worse a situation that's already bad to begin with. And I appreciate your sort of drilling down on the health service, that also highlighting the fact that this isn't just like a charitable situation here, that this was part of a transactional agreement that's very much in keeping with several other ones that have been the part of the experience between Native American communities and the US government. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that, and certainly the specificities about the contaminants in the physical environment, which speaks to your area of specialization as well.
I mean, this is not an area that I myself have conducted a lot of research around Navajo Nation. There have been folks out of University of New Mexico that have done a lot of research in this area. looking at kidney health and other kinds of health impacts. You have Navajo scientists like Tommy Rock, who's been doing a lot of work in this area. People like Carletta Chief, who is in Arizona. So there are Navajo scientists who have been doing a lot of work to try to think about how do you clean up water sources? How do you clean up messes that have been made by settlers, by the colonial powers, as you know, resources extracted and then the mess just left behind. And that happens in a lot of places. So in Akwesasne, where the environment was contaminated by the General Motors plant that dumped all these PCBs in the river, they're still left behind with an 11-acre landfill because General Motors declared bankruptcy and washed its hands of a lot of these sites. And so you have a general trend of, you know, extracting resources, doing your manufacturing, leaving behind a lot of mess and not taking into account what does that mean for the people who have always lived in that area and are going to. So people are like, oh, why don't they just move? You know, when Love Canal was discovered to be such a contaminated site, people fought to get their homes bought out so they could leave, so they could move to other places. And Indigenous communities have fought so hard to maintain these little bitty land bases in their traditional territories. So the option to just up and move somewhere else is not a viable one. So the only answer is really to clean up the messes that are there, and more importantly, to prevent future messes. It's really hard to clean water once it's contaminated. It's incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult. And most of the time, you know, people don't do a good job. And so the only answer is to prevent future water contamination if you're going to protect future generations from these health conditions.
COVID-19 has exposed lots of underlying conditions for lots of people. Food security being one of them. You recently discussed in a blog post how the health threat posed by COVID-19, coupled with the economic fallout experienced as a result of the pandemic, has laid bare and exacerbated the food insecurity issues faced by many Native American communities. Could you unpack that a bit for us? What is the relationship between these dynamics? What are your concerns about the current situation and the way things are going?
So at the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody ran to the grocery store and then panicked because everybody had hoarded all of this food and the shelves were empty, this also was even more difficult for people who are on food assistance, for people who maybe didn't have the ability to hoard, for people who then went shopping for their families and there was nothing there. So for Native people who need a little bit of help getting the nutrients they need, people can access SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, like other low-income communities, or there's another program called the Food Distribution Program on Indian reservations. That's a way of getting food boxes to people who might not be able to utilize SNAP that well because they're not that close to grocery stores. And so people who were running these food distribution offices were talking about the challenges of, you know, now being able to get enough food to put together these boxes for their clients, and having their clients kind of, you know, really concerned, like, am I going to be able to store up enough food? And something that these programs have been fighting for a while. So my friend Joe Van Alstyne has been working with the Food Box Working Group, and he's out there in Michigan with the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa. And, you know, he and others have been pushing for a long time to say, okay, rather than the federal government deciding where this food is coming from for these boxes, you know, give us the money and we'll buy local. And then it doesn't have to be shipped all over creation. And so there, in his case, on one hand, he was helping to manage a local tribal farm, which, you know, right next door. So there's this farm that suddenly is finding itself without the usual markets. And a lot of, you know, smaller farms were faced with these issues. If you're used to selling to restaurants and, you know, farmers markets and the casino and all of these other folks, suddenly those markets were gone. And so on one hand, he had a farm that didn't have markets. On another hand, he had a food distribution program that was trying to figure out how to get access to all this stuff. He's like, this is really silly. We could be buying the produce right here from our own local people. So that's something that the different organizations have been working to push through the Farm Bill. There's an Indian Farm Bill coalition that's been pushing to say, okay, let's give tribes more control over these food distribution programs, because basically what this has pointed out to everybody is the importance of shoring up your local food systems. Because if there are shortages, and you're waiting for food to be trucked all over the country, that could be a dangerous thing if there's disruptions to these supply chains, if you don't have the people to drive them around, if food is getting sent other places and not to your community. And so what this has really highlighted, this whole situation, has been, how do you make communities more food secure by supporting food producers right within those communities?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there are opportunities potentially for a meaningful change to business as usual, vis-a-vis the access to quality food and healthcare access in Native and Indigenous communities. You're citing one example of how that could work.
Yeah, I mean, people suddenly became very interested in gardening. And, a lot of people in the US, not just Indigenous people. So everybody rushed out and bought all the seeds, and everybody was going to panic and put in a garden. A lot of the folks who work with the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network were describing about how, like, they got all these requests all of a sudden. And Rowan White, who runs the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, put a call out that said, okay, for Indigenous families, if you need seeds, let us know. And she put together these seed packets, and hundreds of people wrote in. So she was packing, thousands of these seeds in little packets to mail out to people. But what it really drove home was that suddenly it was good that everybody was like interested in gardening. We've been trying to get lots of people interested in gardening for a long time, and people are like, it's so much work when you can just go to the grocery store. And what's the problem? Like, why am I going to do all this work to grow a pepper when I can just go to the grocery store and get a pepper? But now people are like, oh crap, I can't go to the grocery store and get a pepper. Tell me again about that gardening thing. And so that was a good thing, that it got people thinking about, what does it mean to completely rely on people all over the world for your food? What would it mean to have a bigger part in that? But it also really drove home how reliant people are on just a few seed distributors. So at one point, anybody whose ancestors were farmers or gardeners or growers would save their own seed. At the end of the season, you saved seed, you traded seed with your neighbors, and that's how you knew what you were going to plant the next year. And now many people who are gardeners just consistently order from a catalog every winter. And that's a fun process too. You can support some great seed providers, and you get to sit down and look at all these great pictures and be like, what are we going to plant next year? But then if next year that company is not there, or that company gets all sold out because everybody panicked and bought all their seeds, people find themselves in a position where it's like, well, I want a garden, but where do I get the seeds for that? So it's really driven home the need for more people to become seed keepers, to learn about gardening for the purposes of saving seeds. So it just means you can't plant anything all over the place. You have to keep different varieties apart so you can save seeds, and you have to know when to harvest those seeds specifically, which might be different from when you would harvest things for produce. And I forget what the original question was, but that's been something that's really come out of this, is thinking, how do we train more seed keepers? How do we create more community-based seed banks? How do we think about how to localize food systems? And that doesn't mean like, oh my God, everybody has to only eat the things you can grow in your backyard, because I like coffee. I like avocado, I like chocolate. And it's not, I have a lot of things growing on my porch right now, but I'm not going to be harvesting coffee beans anytime soon. But I will be able to get some, tomatoes and squashes and herbs and spices and those kind of things. Lettuces.
Excellent, excellent. So you talked a little bit about gardening as a traditional foodway practice. Are there other ones that you wanted to highlight that have either met a resurgence of interest in terms of either within Native and Indigenous communities, or sort of beyond that population?
I think, the lockdowns hit this spring, and everybody was just eager to just get back outside. Everybody stuck at home. And I think a lot more people were thinking about foraging as well, in addition to gardening, what can I get outside and eat? What can I go, what little green things are popping up? So I think that was the case both for Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks, which then kind of brought up concerns again about what happens when people who don't know how to do that sustainably are out there just ripping up everything. So something like ramps, which are a type of onion, it's really delicious, but it takes a patch of ramps several years to kind of get to that point where you can pick it. And if you go in and rip them all up, you've destroyed that and it's not sustainable. And so there were different online workshops, and that's something that's been interesting that's come out of this, is a lot of webinars and Zoom opportunities for people to speak about these Native food issues. So the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance sponsored several of these. The Indian Ag Council helped to sponsor a whole virtual food summit with NAFSA. The I Collective, which is a group of chefs, sponsored several of these webinars. And so there was the opportunity for people to kind of speak about these issues. And when it came to foraging, one of the things that came up was eat some of those invasives out there. You have all of these plants that are delicate and rare, like ramps, that are delicious, but also what are, dandelions are everywhere. Japanese knotweed is everywhere. Garlic mustard is everywhere, and nobody's going to miss that if you go rip up a bunch of that. So it became about, educating people on what are other things you can pull up and eat that won't be harmful to the environment, that won't also disrupt Indigenous people's access to some of these foods as well.
Great. Yeah, that really sort of highlighted some things for us to be thinking about moving forward. In conclusion, here we talked about the relationship between environment, health, Native communities in this era of COVID-19. I'd like to close on what fundamental changes you would like to see us make as a society that could better safeguard a better future for all of us.
Clean up your messes. So I'm hoping, I don't have much hope for this administration, but I'm hoping the next EPA will do a better job of not being lax with letting people just dump their waste into the environment so that it'll all float downstream or float in the air. And because that waste impacts people who already have all these underlying conditions. So, there's no coincidence that asthma impacts people of color worse than everybody else. And it's because of the type of air quality people are exposed to. The people who rely on fish that they're catching are the ones who are being impacted by the mining waste that's being dumped in. The pipelines that are being pushed through at the behest of the fossil fuel industry are not going to impact rich white suburbanites. They're going to impact Indigenous people who won't have access to wild rice after it's killed by, this waste from the pipelines leaking, or mines that people are trying to push through in Wisconsin and Minnesota that would impact food sources. So don't make messes and clean up the messes that you've made. I think it's just a general life lesson. And thinking about, what is environmental health, what is environmental justice, in a broad sense. So police violence is an environmental issue. If you can't go outside because you're afraid of being targeted by people for your skin color, for your background, that's an environmental justice issue. So cleaning up the environment is also cleaning up our policing systems, cleaning up our political systems. There's a lot of messes to be cleaned up all around. And I think, this is really high, that a lot of this has really bubbled to the surface during this time. And I don't think that's a coincidence that, people are looking around at the statistics and they're tired of it. And let's make that better. Yeah.
Absolutely. Words to live by. Thank you so much, Professor Elizabeth Hoover. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Larrieux.
Enjoy the day.
You too.